Hey, everybody. I'm Nathaniel Gleischer. I'm head of cybersecurity policy at Facebook. Before Facebook, I'm trained as a lawyer and as a computer scientist. Before coming to Facebook, I investigated and prosecuted cybercrime cases, built secure computer systems, and worked in cybersecurity and national security policy. For most of my career, I've worked in some aspect of security, in particular thinking about how, when you have a determined adversary trying to break whatever you're doing, you work to stay ahead of that. At Facebook, I lead our work detecting and countering information operations. This is how we define information operations at Facebook, and it's a particularly intentional definition. There's a few pieces here that are especially important. We would call an information operation any coordinated effort. So I should say information operations, that is an attempt to manipulate public debate, happen across a range of social media platforms. They sometimes involve traditional media, they involve other platforms. But for us, we're thinking about how they're used or how people try to misuse our platform to accomplish this type of goal. So we're looking not for one asset, but for groups, pages, accounts, all working together. So it's a coordinated effort. Second, it needs to be involved in manipulation or corruption. That is some component of deception, something that is trying to deceive people or manipulate how they perceive what's around them. Third, the target of an information operation is public debate. People are trying to change how public debate is happening in a country or a region. They're trying to drive division, or they're trying to push a particular narrative. And last, the goal is a strategic one. It's not just about making money, although we've seen information operations where people do make money, but they're trying to either accomplish a political goal or a strategic goal. I joined Facebook about 1.5 years ago, and the focus of my role is to bring together all the different efforts across the company that are working to combat information operations. We've seen this as a challenge for some time, as you would expect, but we've got product teams working on this, we have threat investigators working on this, we have policy experts thinking about this, data scientists. How do you pull them all together and have sort of a whole of company strategy to tackle this? To do this, we've built an information operations threat disruptions team. Over the course of the last few years, this team has investigated and disrupted information operations around the world. These are a few examples. In each case like this, we will investigate it, we'll understand what's happening, what the cluster is that's involved in it. We will take steps to publicize and make sure people understand what we've seen, and then we'll take it down. We'll remove it from the platform. Work with law enforcement, work with civil society and other external partners to make sure they understand what happens. As you can see, we've taken action against campaigns targeting public debate here in the US, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. When people think about information operations, they tend to think about governments, for example, Russia, trying to manipulate public debate in another country. But we actually see a wide range of activity. Certainly, there are governments trying to manipulate public debate across borders. Another place we've seen this, we've done a number of takedowns involving content linked to the government of Iran. In addition, we see governments acting domestically, essentially targeting their own citizens. We've done a number of takedowns that people have seen involving activity and content within Myanmar. In addition to that, we see non-government actors acting internationally and acting domestically. The types of things you might imagine here would be essentially a deception for hire campaign, where any number of people could try to use that to drive their own ends. The critical thing to remember when we're thinking about information operations, and the reason that we've been so focused on it, is that this is fundamentally a security problem. And what I mean by that is we're facing determined adversaries. Whenever we put a system in place to try to stop them, they're not just going to give up. They're going to try to route around that system or subvert that system. We've obviously seen cases where actors have tried to avoid a system we put in place, but we've also, as I said, see them try to actively subvert it. We have systems set up so that people can report when users violate our policies. And we've seen organized actors use that reporting to try to mass report individual accounts and get their targets taken down improperly off the platform. One of the basic principles here is that whatever system you try to put out, they're going to try to manipulate. The goal here is that over time, if you build the right systems, you can make life harder and harder and harder for these types of bad actors. You're never going to get them to give up, but you can make them slower, you can make them weaker, you can make them more exposed, and you can empower your own teams, right? This is not new. This is rooted in security strategy. People in information security and cybersecurity and in all types of security disciplines for generations have been thinking about this type of approach. For us, this idea is embodied in some sense in this concept of adversarial design, which is what I want to talk to you about today. When we think about product design normally, we're in some sense designing for our users. The users and the developers and designers are kind of on the same team. Right? It may well be that the user comes up with, and often do, they come up with uses we never thought of for our products. But our goal is to build products with some kind of positive tool or use, and the users want to discover that and figure out how to use it. We're working together in most product design. That is not the case in adversarial design. In adversarial design, the user fundamentally is looking to evade or manipulate whatever we do. And it's a very different environment in which to operate. And it demands a little bit of a different way of thinking about things. Over the last few years, we've learned what I like to think are some useful lessons, and also, quite frankly, some painful lessons on how to innovate in the face of adversaries like that. So that's what I wanted to talk through. But before we dive into adversarial design, I think it's important to remember that the vast majority of users on any platform that any of us is building are authentic, well-meaning people, right? On Facebook, they want to organize, fundraise for causes they believe in. They want to build businesses. They want to connect with family and friends. Of this very large community, only a tiny portion violate our policies. Now, if we zoom in on the tiny portion, actually, the majority of that group are engaged in spam or fraud, some other type of not particularly sophisticated threat, right? They're trying to drive financial goals. They're trying to do other sorts of things. Within this zoomed-in portion, only that tiny tip are engaged in what I would describe as information operations, determined, sophisticated, well-funded adversaries that are going to continue to evade and subvert any kind of techniques you put in place. Adversarial design is optimized to deal with this tiny subset of users. And the reason is, even though it's only a few users, they can cause an outsized amount of harm. Their goal, in some sense, is to cause that harm. And so it's really important to have a system and to be thinking through how to deal with that threat. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that they really are a tiny subset of the total community. So we would never want adversarial design to swallow the broader goals of our product design work, right? The goal of our design and development is to enable all the positive uses people want to make and the vast majority of people engage in. But within that, adversarial design is really useful and important to stay ahead of the type of harm that can be caused by a determined adaptive group of threat actors. So what is adversarial design? Essentially, I think of it in a simple cycle with 4 stages. That is about understanding the type of bad behavior or threats that the actors are bringing, adapting to deal with them in the short term, and then scaling to deal with it in the long term. So first, threat actors are continually innovating and looking for ways to evade and manipulate any sort of platform any of us is developing, which means that we have to have a mechanism to understand what they're doing and not just understand it and then stop, but actually keep up with the evolving threats that they're developing. Second, each time we identify a new threat, we need a mechanism to deal with it in the short term. And the truth is that most new threats that we see from actors like this don't look like other threats we've seen before, because these threat actors are motivated to find new ways to get around our systems. They know we know how to deal with the threat they did last month, so they're going to come up with something new and different. What that means is this enforcement capability needs to be flexible. The challenge is a flexible enforcement capability often doesn't move as fast as anyone would like because you're constantly dealing with new corner cases. So the third thing is we need a way to identify these threats as they develop and then build scaled solutions to deal with them as they grow and expand. And then lastly, because the threat actors will continue to innovate, we need a mechanism to look at the system that we put in place, recognize where that pushed the threat actors to, and prepare for that. Right? The goal of all of this is to push our threat actors to a weaker and slower and less effective position. So we need to be constantly looking to see where is that position, how do we get ready for that, whatever's going to come next. So that makes this a continuous effort. You're constantly running through this cycle, just as you would through any design cycle. And each of these pieces is critical. The example that I want to talk about today is how we've applied this at Facebook in the context of information operations. Because this is a particular blended, complex threat where we're seeing determined adversaries trying to manipulate public debate. And so we've built kind of each of these cycles as part of that team I talked about. First, we have a threat intelligence team. This is a team that's made up of expert investigators that come from law enforcement, the intelligence community, the cybersecurity research community, investigative journalism. All people whose careers are built on picking apart a complex situation and identifying what's happening, even when there's someone actively trying to conceal what's actually going on. This team is supported by data science and other types of scaled systems that let them drive their investigations more quickly. And they also work with a range of external partners, whether that's law enforcement or civil society. Because the more eyeballs you have on a problem like this, the more insight you're going to get and the more effective you can be. Second, we have our information operations threat disruptions process, which as a name is a bit of a mouthful. But what's important about it is it's the mechanism we use to handle these new threats as they evolve. Whenever the threat intelligence team sees a new threat, we bring it to this process. This is human-driven. You run through multiple stages of review. And it's built to deal with new challenges, a new technique we maybe haven't seen before. The first time that we see a threat actor try to use a network of fake accounts in a way we've never seen them before, we want to be able to account for that and respond. And we want to make sure that we have enough controls in place so that as we're doing this analysis and dealing with these new changes, we're not moving too quickly. We're not taking any kind of action we would want to take, and we're moving deliberately. The challenge with that is to be that flexible to deal with all those new threats. This system by itself isn't going to scale to deal with threats around the world as they evolve. You saw all of the dots I put on the board earlier. Those are the takedowns that are driven from this process. And there are dozens of them. And dozens is a really good number when you're dealing with the most sophisticated threats. But when bad actors start to scale their techniques, you need something that works at more scale. So we have a dedicated information operations product development team that works with our threat investigators and works with their product teams around the company. And what they do is each time we run one of these takedowns, we work to identify the specific behaviors that the actors are using in that case. We work to understand them and then to build scaled solutions to make them much more difficult. For example, we have automated systems that will detect and remove fake accounts. And we have systems that require verification and transparency around political ads. Both of these I'll talk more about in a minute, but developing both of them was sort of driven by this cycle. And then fourth, the entire team meets regularly to assess where the threats are that we're seeing, to red team our own processes and the types of challenges we see coming in, and to think through how we can adapt our own defenses to make sure not just that we're ready for whatever's coming next, but as much as possible to try to get to where we think they're going. You put all of this together, and what's really most powerful about it is what we've seen is when you have the automated systems running, what they effectively do is they clean up the threat environment so that those human expert investigators can focus on the newest type of threats. So over time, as the cycle runs, you get this kind of virtuous cycle effect where the threat investigators can continually focus on the newest challenges. And then when we identify them and understand them, we can feed them down into more automated systems to make sure that the threat investigators can deal with what's coming next. So let me give you a couple of examples of how we've run this cycle and some of the challenges we've dealt with. First, let me talk about fake accounts. Information operations rely heavily on fake accounts. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because if I want to try to convince you of something, the first thing I want to do is make myself look and sound and seem like you. Because whatever I say, you're going to be more likely to believe it. And threat actors, by and large, use fake accounts and inauthentic accounts to conceal their identities and to present the face they want to present to their targets. Now, as I go through each of these, part of what's interesting is we're in a different place in the adversarial design cycle for each one. If we take fake accounts, we've known that bad actors use fake accounts for years. And we have automated systems in place that today will detect and remove millions of fake accounts every day, most within minutes of their creation. But what's interesting here is fake accounts are so useful for these bad actors. It's not as if when we build this, they try to get a fake account on the platform and it fails, they stop, right? They keep trying and they keep pushing to make their systems more effective, to try to evade our detection. And so we deal with this in two ways. First, we're continually running through that adversarial design cycle, right? When fake accounts defeat our systems, we examine that, we understand why, and we adapt the detection so that we'll catch them next time. And second, we have the threat intelligence team that's looking for the much more sophisticated types of fake accounts, right? You can really, when you think about fake accounts, there are fake accounts built at scale, and then there are fake accounts that are curated by one or two people that are really trying to make them look realistic. That latter kind is obviously much more difficult to catch, and it's also much more expensive to create. Our threat investigators focus on those types of sophisticated fake accounts, not just to catch them and take them down, but actually they become the anchor point for many of our major takedowns. So we're simultaneously using the innovation that these threat actors are developing to find them and to improve our automated systems to find them at scale. Second, one of the things that we've seen as there's been this back and forth around fake accounts is increasing use of what we would call deceptive pages. So actors trying to deceive people through the pages that they're creating, a different surface on the platform than the accounts. We have a number of recent takedowns, investigations and takedowns, that have identified this type of behavior. For example, not that long ago, we did a takedown involving a network of news pages that were built and designed to look independent and local, and were operating across the Baltics and Eastern Europe, that our investigators were able to confirm were in fact run by employees of Sputnik News. These pages are designed to accomplish the deception themselves. But in addition to our threat investigators doing this ongoing analysis and looking for this type of behavior, we've also built a set of transparency tools that help to expose these techniques when we see them. And the goal here is a couple of things. First, so you can see an example up here which shows a lot of information about a particular page. And what's interesting about this, and the piece I want to draw your attention to, is this is a page called Americans for Democracy. And if you look down to the middle, you can see that the location that the administrators of that page are in is Macedonia. Now, there could certainly be reasons why you might have a page administered by people in one country and followed by people in another country. But in this case, the mismatch looks a little odd. And what we're doing here is essentially exposing this. We've seen consistently that threat actors use pages like this to essentially conceal or launder their location. And what we're doing here is making that much more difficult. First, by exposing this, it enables reporters, it enables civil society partners, it enables cybersecurity researchers and others to do their own investigations, to see these mismatches. And we've worked on a number of investigations that have started because external partners have seen something like this and have enabled us to work with them and all of us to sort of take action against this behavior. The second thing that it does is, remember, every action in adversarial design is going to force the adversary to take some action themselves. The threat actors try to evade this technique. They might conceal their identity in some other way. They might try to hide their location. But what that tends to do is drive them to use fake accounts and use other techniques that help us find them and help us stop them. So this is the sort of continuous cycle that we're seeing. We have the investigations going on, and then the automated systems that ideally make those investigations easier and more effective. Third, political advertising. So it's clear at this point that threat actors and bad actors look to use advertising to amplify their deceptive messages. We have our threat intelligence team looking for this type of behavior, but in addition to that, we've built two things. First is a set of transparency tools, like the one you can see here, that shows who's running an ad, how much money they're spending on it, whom they're running it to. Again, providing that information so that external investigators can see it themselves. In addition, we've built a set of verification tools. And this is particularly an interesting example from the context of adversarial design, because we've really seen it change behavior. What we have basically done is said, if you want to run political ads or issue ads in advance of an election, you have got to verify that you are domestic, that you are within the country that you're running the ad from. And in some countries, this might require you to provide an ID, provide a home address where you could receive a postcard, steps that sort of establish bona fides as a local. And what's interesting is, we've seen bad actors try to get verified and fail, provide fake IDs that weren't good enough and not get through the controls, right? But of course, no security protocol is foolproof. We've seen bad actors try to route around this in different ways. One of the most interesting is trying to hire domestic people to run ads for them. Now, what's particularly interesting about that is in a number of countries, surreptitiously running ads on behalf of a foreign party is actually illegal. So some of these people might get visits from local law enforcement. What we've done here is we've sort of forced the bad actors not to stop, but to have to work harder, to have to work slower, to spend their time trying to defeat the controls we put in place, and to expose themselves and their collaborators to more risk. Last example, because I think this one is particularly interesting in sort of where this space is going, and it also reminds us that adversarial design actually isn't just about product. One of the things we saw, particularly around the US midterms, and as we've seen since then, are attempts not just to run networks of fake accounts, but to try to create the impression, the false impression, that networks of fake accounts exist. So, in other words, to sort of prey on the fear of manipulation rather than actually manipulating. This is linked to the core strategy we've seen from a number of these threat actors, where part of their goal is to make themselves seem bigger and scarier and more effective than they actually are. Because if people are afraid of manipulation, then they can directly exploit that fear. And what's challenging about this, right, I mentioned earlier that these types of operations happen across a number of platforms and in different ways, right? Something like this, you don't need large networks of things that have technical indicators that our teams can find. And so our threat intelligence team obviously is looking for this type of behavior, and we take action on it when we see it, but we might not see it. It might be happening somewhere else. And so when we think about how to scale to deal with this, the way you scale that is most effective in a context like this is actually partnerships. So around the US midterms, representatives from government, from civil society, from industry, all worked together to deal with this challenge. One of the things we saw was not just sharing of threat information, but actually constant messaging from each of the players, demonstrating that we are looking for evidence of manipulation, and we're not seeing it. So the US government put out a series of announcements along these lines. Industry said this, civil society said this. And all of this together has the effect of essentially inoculating the public a little bit against this type of manipulation. It's another kind of scaled enforcement, even though we're not using a product change here. But it's this same principle. You push them to make this harder. And now the interesting question is, where do they go next? So this is 4 examples, specific examples in the context of Facebook of the way we've used adversarial design to address information operations. There are, however, a few takeaways that I think are more abstractable that apply anytime you use something like adversarial design. I just want to talk about these 5. First, combining experts and automation. We often talk about, or some people talk about AI as sort of a silver bullet to solve these big problems. What I have found is that automated systems are very effective at scale, and they can struggle with new corner cases. Human experts are really good in dealing with novel challenges, but they really struggle when faced with massive scale. And so combining the two in the sort of flow that we described turns out to be really effective because they reinforce each other. Second, designing with data. One of the things that I have found in the information operations space is that the threats we face move incredibly quickly. The nature of the threats we see today look interestingly and remarkably different than what we saw 6 months ago. Humans can pivot very quickly. Automation can be very fast once it's built, but it takes time to build, which means that if we don't have the data in place to make sure we're designing the automation to deal with the right problem, you can end up way down the line in your development cycle and not have the right tool to deal with the scaled threat you're facing. So anchoring the design cycle in the data about what's happening and what we think is going to happen is incredibly critical. But at the same time, there's an interesting challenge in this space, which is that because we're thinking about where they're going, measuring impact can be incredibly difficult. And so we need a combination of qualitative and quantitative assessments. Let me give you this example because I think it really highlights it. 2 recent takedowns we did. One involved a deception for hire company that was running 220-something pages and had about 43 million followers across all of these assets. And they were basically running these deceptive campaigns. The other really centered around one event that was encouraging people to come out into the physical world to counter-protest another event. Clearly, the goal was to get people into the streets, face-to-face with people they disagreed with, to try to foment some kind of physical conflict. And about 600 people RSVP'd to that event before we took it down. And we took it down before the event took place. The question is, which of these is more serious? Which of these has greater impact? How do you measure that? It turns out that's incredibly difficult. They both have very serious consequences, but they're very different. And if we rely purely on statistics, it's really hard to build a system that's going to actually understand relative consequence. And so the qualitative assessment is really important to complement the quantitative assessment. And then two last points. First is cross-functional collaboration. So we talk a lot about the 30,000 people across the company that are focused on safety and security right now at Facebook. And that scale is incredibly important because it lets us work effectively in all the languages and countries we need to deal with. But for information operations, that is essential, but the cross-collaboration, pulling the teams together, is critical as well. Our threat disruptions team has representatives from all these functions and others working side by side every day. And what we've found that means is it means that we can move our cycle very quickly, we can identify gaps really quickly, and we're more likely to come up with out-of-box fixes. Even blended fixes that might take a little piece of a product innovation here, a bit of a policy change over here, and a partnerships play. And you put those together and you're able to deal with a threat. At a smaller company, it might be one person wearing all of these hats, right? But mindfully thinking about the different capabilities that could be brought to bear against a problem, I think is extremely important. And then last, the sort of corollary to that, which is you can't do this alone, right? I mentioned when we think about information operations, they happen across platforms. Any type of adversarial design, it's tempting to think that our security teams are sort of like the last line of defense. But often I've found you might need law enforcement to impose deterrence on a bad actor. You might need industry partners to think with you together about what the right boundaries are and how to enforce against it. In some cases, the bad actors that any of us might be dealing with could be a government. In that context, you might need civil society, who can take their own, who can hold them to account in the ways that they can do so. All these pieces need to come together. And so really thinking about the multidisciplinary nature of adversarial design, both inside the company and outside of it, is particularly important. So these are a few different insights that I think apply across different ways you would apply adversarial design. If we think about these, and the conversation, sort of the talk that I've been giving here as we think this through, all of this, as we said at the beginning, is deeply rooted in security strategy, right? Much of this isn't new. If you look at what information security operatives do, if you look at how cybersecurity experts think about this, critically, if you look at how physical security teams think about this, you can draw a lot of these principles out. As we move onto the network, people have been saying for a little while, I think, there's this phrase offense dominant, which basically stands for the presumption that the network is fundamentally better for attackers than defenders, and that those of us who are trying to build secure systems or who are trying to protect public debate are fundamentally at a disadvantage. And it's easy to imagine that that's true, simply because the speed of the threats we see today, the way they change, how quickly they change, and the scale and the consequence is so large. So it's easy to think that this notion of offense dominance is actually true. But in fact, part of what's so interesting about adversarial design is if we look at the way the cycle works, you'll see that that notion is critically incomplete. Attackers have advantages, absolutely. But defenders have a really critical advantage too, and that's why adversarial design works. Historically, when we think about security, defenders win when they control the terrain of conflict. Right? This has always been true. If we go back to the Battle of Marathon and the Persian War, we come all the way up to the way the Secret Service protects the President of the United States today. It's about controlling the environment. What's particularly interesting here is that for all of us who are building systems today, if we're dealing with bad actors that are trying to manipulate them, we are the terrain. We are critical pieces of the terrain. And that means that we can change the terrain faster and more effectively than has ever been possible before. Right? If you're the Secret Service and you want to make a stadium safe for the president to speak, you need weeks and months because you have to move a bunch of one-ton barricades. You have to physically change the physical environment. You have to lock doors. You have to do all sorts of things. In this context, we can make changes to the platform over time that makes the activity that these bad actors are trying to engage in more difficult and makes the work of our defender teams more effective. And what's interesting about that is the way that I like to think about it in the context of the terrain is we're essentially changing the slope of the field. Each change we make, it's not as if the bad actors stop. They're always going to come back. But if you push them downhill, each time they come back, they're further downhill. They're in a slightly weaker position. The next thing they try is a little bit slower and is a little bit harder. And over time, you can tip the scales to the advantage of the threat intelligence teams that you have, and the security development that you're doing. This is the principle of adversarial design, and this is sort of this idea of pulling this over from the discipline of security strategy. So none of this stops, right? The point of this being a cycle is that, as tempting as it would be to say we've sort of solved this and walk away, that generally doesn't happen. But what does happen, and the reason it's a continuous cycle, is over time you tilt the environment to be better for defenders and harder for attackers. And that's the general principle. We've seen how that can start to work in the context of information operations. And so I wanted to talk it through here today just to sort of express some of the thinking we've seen, some of the lessons we've learned, and hopefully that's helpful to all of you guys. So good luck out there, and thank you for listening.